In the brutal heat of a Philadelphia summer, 1776, a group of men gathered with a quiet, grim sense of purpose. They weren't kings or conquerors. They were lawyers, merchants, doctors, and farmers. They were men with property, education, families, and futures. And one by one, they stepped forward to sign a document that was, for all intents and purposes, their own death warrant. Before we knew them as the Founding Fathers, they were branded by the most powerful empire on earth as traitors. And under British law, the penalty for high treason was terrifying: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was a brutal public spectacle meant to put the fear of God into anyone else who dared to dream of freedom. This is the story of what these men stood to lose, and what so many of them paid, for the birth of a nation. This is why signing the Declaration of Independence was a death sentence. Imagine for a second that you have everything to lose: a comfortable home, a successful business, the respect of your community, a family that counts on you. Now, imagine being asked to risk every last bit of it on an idea. Not a sure thing, not a guarantee, but a wild and proven idea that people should have the power to govern themselves. The men in the Pennsylvania State House faced this exact choice. The war for independence had already started. Shots had been fired at Lexington and Concord, and the rage of battle had been felt at Bunker Hill. But signing the Declaration was the point of no return. It was a leap from the cliff of rebellion into the abyss of all-out revolution, with no idea what was waiting at the bottom. As Benjamin Franklin supposedly told the others, with a dark humor that barely hid the terror of the situation, "We must, indeed, all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." They knew the price, and still, they signed. To really get the weight of that moment, you have to understand the world of 1776. This wasn't some sudden flare-up of anger. Tensions between America and Great Britain had been simmering for more than a decade. A series of British policies, meant to tighten control and squeeze money out of the colonies, had lit a fire of resentment. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, each one felt like a fundamental attack on their rights as Englishmen. The rallying cry, "No taxation without representation," was everywhere, from the busy ports of Boston to the quiet farms of Georgia. For years, the colonists had tried everything else. They protested, they boycotted, they sent letters and delegates to London, begging the king and parliament to just hear them out. They saw themselves as loyal British subjects who were just asking for their rights. But with every plea, the Crown's response got tougher. British troops were sent in, Boston Harbor was closed, and the colonies were officially declared to be in a state of rebellion. It was clear the government wasn't looking for reconciliation. By early 1776, the mood had reached a tipping point. Blood had been spilled, and the Continental Army, led by George Washington, was a real thing. But even then, the idea of a total break was radical, even scary, to a lot of people. It's one thing to fight for your rights within the British Empire. It's another thing entirely to declare yourself a new country. Then, in January of that year, a little pamphlet called Common Sense started making the rounds. Written by an English immigrant named Thomas Paine, it was a fiery, electrifying case for independence. Paine didn't bother with complicated legal arguments. He spoke in plain, powerful language that regular people could understand. He called King George III a royal brute, and said the idea of a tiny island ruling a whole continent was just plain absurd. Common Sense sold hundreds of thousands of copies, spreading like wildfire and making the case for independence in the public mind. It was in this charged atmosphere that the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. The delegates were split. Some, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, still hoped for peace. But a determined group, led by John Adams of Massachusetts and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, argued that the time for talking was over. On June 7, 1776, Lee put it on the table that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The debate was intense. The men in that room knew exactly what this meant. They weren't just debating a political document. They were deciding the fate of their families, their homes, and their own lives. To vote yes was to commit treason. There was no going back. After weeks of passionate argument, on July 2nd, the Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, they formally adopted the final text of the Declaration of Independence, written mostly by a brilliant young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. We all know the Declaration for its famous preamble about self-evident truths: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But for the 56 men who signed it, the most dangerous part came at the very end. It was a formal pledge, a contract sealed not with wax, but with the very core of who they were. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. This wasn't just fancy language. It was a literal vow, and every man in that room knew the terrifying reality behind those words. First, our lives. This was the most immediate risk. In the eyes of British law, they were all traitors. While the official penalty for treason was the medieval horror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered, the more likely reality for captured rebel leaders was to be thrown in a prison ship or a squalid jail, to be starved, frozen, and left to die of disease. This was the fate that awaited them if their gamble failed. They were now marked men, fugitives from the most powerful military on the planet. Second, our fortunes. The signers weren't a bunch of broke rabble-rousers. Many were some of the wealthiest men in America. 24 were lawyers, 11 were merchants, 9 were plantation owners. They had built fortunes in trade, agriculture, and law. They owned huge estates, fleets of ships, and successful businesses. By signing, they put all of it on the line. If the revolution failed, their property would be seized by the crown. But even if it succeeded, the war itself was a direct threat to their livelihood. Their farms would become battlefields, their ships would be captured by the British Navy, and their businesses would be destroyed by the chaos. They were basically writing a blank check to fund a revolution, drawn on their own bank accounts. And finally, our sacred honor. In the 18th century, a gentleman's honor was everything. It was his reputation, his integrity, his legacy. It was more valuable than money and as precious as life itself. If they failed, they wouldn't be remembered as patriots. They would go down in history as criminals and fools who brought ruin on their people. Their names would be disgraced for generations. They were staking their legacy on the hope that their cause was just and that history would see them not as traitors, but as founders. They pledged it all: their lives to the gallows or prison, their fortunes to the war, and their honor to the judgment of history. The pledge they made wasn't just theoretical. The war that followed brought the consequences of their decision crashing down on them. While the popular story that every single signer was systematically hunted down and ruined isn't quite true, the reality is that many paid an enormous price. Their story showed just how real the sacrifice was. For some, signing the Declaration instantly made them fugitives. Take John Hart of New Jersey. Honest John was a 65-year-old farmer with a big family. When the British Army swept through New Jersey in late 1776, he became a marked man. Hart was forced to flee his home, leaving behind his wife, Deborah, who was on her deathbed. For over a year, this old man was hunted, sleeping in forests and caves to escape capture. When he finally returned, he found his farm destroyed, his property gone, and his wife dead. His 13 children had been scattered to find safety with neighbors. John Hart died in 1779, broken by grief and exhaustion, never living to see the independence he'd risked everything for. Then there was Francis Lewis of New York. A wealthy merchant, Lewis knew what was at stake. Soon after he signed, the British captured Long Island and deliberately targeted his estate. They plundered it and burned it to the ground. Then, they captured his wife, Elizabeth, and threw her in a filthy prison with barely enough food to survive. Her treatment was so cruel that General Washington himself intervened to arrange a prisoner exchange. But the damage was done. Elizabeth was released, but her health was shattered. She died 2 years later, a direct casualty of her husband's patriotism. For those who were captured, the pledge of their lives became a terrifying reality. 5 signers were taken prisoner by the British. The most prominent was Richard Stockton of New Jersey. A respected judge, Stockton was betrayed by a loyalist informant. He was dragged from his bed and thrown in a common jail, treated like a criminal. He was starved and exposed to the freezing cold, and the abuse permanently broke his health. When he was finally released, he returned home to find his estate looted and his library, one of the finest in the colonies, burned. Stockton died in 1781, just 50 years old. Other signers, including George Walton, Thomas Hayward Jr., Arthur Middleton, and Edward Rutledge, were captured as military officers during the Siege of Charleston in 1780. They were held as prisoners of war for nearly a year. For many, the pledge of their fortunes was called in full. Carter Braxton of Virginia was a wealthy planter and trader. The British Navy captured his ships, wiping out his main source of income. He poured what was left of his money into the Revolution. After the war, the man who once lived in luxury died in poverty. But perhaps no one gave more than Robert Morris of Pennsylvania, the financier of the Revolution. When the Continental Army was on the verge of collapse, it was Morris who personally secured the loans and supplies to keep the fight going. He used his own money and his own credit to back the new nation. While his efforts were critical to victory, the massive financial risks he took and later speculations ruined him. The man who financed a nation ended up in debtor's prison for several years. And then there's the incredible story of Thomas Nelson Jr. of Virginia. During the final siege of Yorktown, American forces cornered the British Army, whose commander, Cornwallis, had set up his headquarters in Nelson's own mansion. Nelson, a general in the Virginia militia, saw that American cannons were avoiding his house. He quietly urged the gunners to fire on his own home, even offering a reward for the first direct hit. The home was destroyed, a symbol of his absolute commitment. After the war, he was left to pay back the wartime loans he had personally guaranteed, and he died bankrupt, having sacrificed his home and his fortune. While no signer was ever formally executed for treason, 9 of them died during the war from hardships or illness. Sometimes the cost was paid by their families. There's a powerful story, though it may be more legend than documented fact, about Abraham Clark of New Jersey. He had 2 sons who were officers in the army. Both were captured and held on the infamous prison ship Jersey, a floating hell where thousands died. The British allegedly made Clark an offer. Take back your signature on the declaration and we'll free your sons. Clark refused. He would not trade his country's freedom for his children's lives. He put his sacred honor above everything. Over the years, the stories of the signers have sometimes been exaggerated. You may have heard a version, often credited to broadcaster Paul Harvey, that paints a picture of universal doom. That 5 were tortured to death, 9 died of battle wounds, and so on. While the sentiment is powerful, historians have clarified that this version has some inaccuracies. So what's the real story? It's important to separate fact from myth, not to diminish their courage, but to understand it better. The truth is, the fates of the 56 men were all different. Not every signer died poor. Some, like the incredibly wealthy Charles Carroll, survived the war with their fortunes intact. Many went on to have long and successful political careers. No signer was captured and executed by the British specifically for signing the Declaration. The captured men were treated as prisoners of war. The claim that 9 died from battle wounds is also not quite right. Only one, Button Gwinnett of Georgia, died from a wound sustained during the war, and it was in a duel with a political rival, not in battle with the British. But does this more complicated reality make them any less brave? Not at all. In fact, it does the opposite. The key is to remember that in July 1776, they had no idea what would happen. They couldn't see the future. They didn't know whose homes would be burned or whose families would suffer. They only knew that by signing that document, they were all marking themselves for ruin and death. Every single man who signed that parchment was putting a noose around his neck. The fact that the rope didn't tighten for all of them doesn't change the fact that they all felt it there. The risk was universal, even if the suffering wasn't. When Richard Stockton was dragged from his bed, it was a terrifying reminder to every other delegate of what could happen. The suffering of one was a threat to all. The real story isn't about a neat list of 56 martyrs. It's about 56 men who willingly took a gamble, knowing that the price of failure could be their life, their family, and their fortune. Their courage wasn't that they all suffered, but that they were all willing to. The story of the signers is the foundational story of American sacrifice. These weren't superheroes. They were real people, husbands, fathers, and sons who had every reason to play it safe. Instead, they chose danger. They chose uncertainty. They chose an ideal over their own security. They pledged their lives, and many had their lives ruined by the war. They pledged their fortunes, and many were left with nothing. They pledged their sacred honor, and in doing so, they earned an honor so great it has lasted for centuries. The United States wasn't inevitable. It was a choice, an argument made on paper and then defended with blood. The price of that argument was immense, paid by the men who dared to sign it and the thousands of soldiers who fought and died for what it stood for. It's easy to celebrate the 4th of July with fireworks, but the real meaning of the day is in the quiet courage of that room in Philadelphia. It's in the stories of men like John Hart hiding in a forest, Thomas Nelson Jr. shelling his own house, and Abraham Clark choosing his country over his own sons. Their sacrifice is a reminder that freedom is fragile. It's an inheritance bought at a terrible price, and it's on every new generation to protect it. The 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence didn't just start a new nation. They set a standard for courage and commitment that we can still look to today. They risked everything for a future they wouldn't get to see, for a country that existed only in their hopes and on the parchment where they boldly wrote their names. If you found this story of sacrifice as powerful as we do, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more dives into the stories that shaped our world. And let us know in the comments, which Signer's story stands out to you the most. Thanks for watching.